Susan Wingrove-Reed, the education consultant for the Anchorage Symphony and also the principal keyboard player. Really excited about the November 12th concert with our guest conductor, Yaniv Attar, and a wonderful program. So let's talk about a few of the details. This program kind of is an acknowledgement of the present and a tribute to the past, all in one package. And it will begin with a piece by Arvo Pärt, who is an Estonian composer, and for over a decade, in the late, like around 2011 to 2018, he was deemed to be the most performed living composer in the world. And he is still alive, born in 1935, and has written a hugely interesting body of work, both in a classical vein and as religious music. He's a very strong Christian. The top and bottom notes of the piano fascinated him when he was a little boy. The middle part of their piano had been damaged in their home, and so he experimented with the sounds on the opposite ends and became so intrigued that at the age of 7, his parents decided to send him to music school, and he then began to compose music as a teenager. But there was a required military service, so he ended up playing the oboe and the percussion in a military band. And when his stint was completed, he went off to conservatory. And one of his colleagues in school said he just seemed to shake his sleeves and the notes would fall out. He graduated in 1963 and then became the producer of music for film and stage and a sound producer for public radio. He experimented with 12-tone music, and it was said of him when he wrote a piece called Credo in 1968 that the music had a dangerously strong impact on the audience, according to the Stalinist regime. And so he was unofficially censored. And his music was forbidden to be played at concerts. So he composed very little for 8 years. During this time, he studied medieval and Renaissance music and explored a new language. And that's at the period that he became an Orthodox Christian. In 1976, he evolved a new style. And the piece we are going to play, If Bach Had Been a Beekeeper, it was the first piece in this new style. As I've mentioned, he's been admired as one of the world's greatest living composers, and musicologist Carrie Cotta stated, he's been able to translate something very human into sound. He emigrated with his family to Vienna in 1980. If Bach Had Been a Beekeeper has the subtitle, Portrait of a Musicologist Against the Backdrop of a Wasp Nest. And I will explain what that title means in just a second. The new style, he gave a name, tintinnabuli, which is Latin for little bell, a kind of a ringing sound. And it's created by using dissonance of putting major and minor seconds together, which are the closest intervals you find on a piano. The piece is dedicated to a music critic whose name was Ophelia Tuisk, and she was a fierce supporter of his during the chilling oppression of Soviet cultural policies. Thus, the subtitle, Portrait of a Musicologist Against the Backdrop of a Wasp Nest. This piece is scored for piano, woodwind quintet, percussion, and strings. And there's a very strong Bach motif in the strings throughout. When the woodwinds are added, there's the sound of swarming bees. The piano maintains a kind of a steady rhythm, a pulse during a lot of the piece. And the notes B, A, C, and in German, H is B minor. So H is, it finishes the spelling of the word Bach, is included especially in the coda, which features the Bach prelude in B minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier. There are 3 voices in the prelude at half speed with the bell sounds and the ringing added, and then the music dies away. And at our concert, we'll segue directly into the overture of the Bach Suite Number 2. This is very concentrated writing. Simple rhythms and gradually progressing melodies are integrated. And the idea behind all of this is a personal and deeply felt quest for beauty, purity, and purpose. This is brilliant, beautiful, and imaginative music. And I know you and our audiences are going to love hearing this piece played live. I came across a poem that had come out in a collection published in 2003 in a book called Skywriting by poet Charles Tomlinson, which seems to have a direct link to this music. The first line of the poem is, "If Bach had been a beekeeper." So let me share this short piece with you. If Bach had been a beekeeper, he would have heard all those notes suspended above one another in the air of his ear as the differentiated swarm returning to the exact hive and place in the hive, topping up the cells with the honey of C major, food for the listening generations, key to their comfort and solace of their distress as they return and return to those counterpointed levels of hovering wings where movement is dance and the air itself a scented garden. Bach had a very rich and interesting life, and his music stands for itself, but let's talk a little bit about his life before the actual music we're going to play. At the time he wrote his suite in B minor, he was working for Prince Leopold in Kärnten, Germany, where his focus became secular music. Bach never went on a tour. He never left South Germany. He married 2 times and had 20 children. He had steady work as a teacher, a composer, and a conductor. His first job in 1702 was as an organist at a church, where he directed choir and orchestra. Everyone was older than him. He was 17. And the famous episode where he got into a street fight with someone who was a little older than him, who he called a Zippelfagotist, a nanny goat bassoonist. And so that led to a brawl. He was put on a 4-week leave as a result of that. He went on tours around Germany to learn about music, just in the southern part, as I've mentioned. And then he once threw his wig at an organist, saying to him, "You would be better off as a cobbler." I love that story. In 1717, he was thrown in jail for 4 weeks for showing disrespect to his employer, and he was dismissed from that position. He went to Kärnten in 1717, and he came into his own finally as a composer and musician. He was on a trip, though, when his wife passed away. They'd had 7 children, and so he was a single dad for a year. But then he became smitten with a soprano who was in his choir in a paid position, married her, and then they had a lot of additional children, going off to Leipzig after the prince married a music-hating princess. Take heart, he was still very human and couldn't stop arguing with his bosses, even in Leipzig as he aged, and including a 3-year feud over who got to pick the hymns for the Sunday services in one of his cathedrals. Really fun stories. So now let's talk about the music. A suite is a series of contrasting dance movements, a very popular genre in the Baroque period. There are 4 surviving orchestral suites by Bach, and all 4 of the overtures, the first movements to these suites, are majestic. What will happen at our concert is we will segue from the Arvo Pärt piece directly into the first movement of this famous suite. The French overture was invented by Jean-Baptiste Lully to start his operas and ballets. And the formula is to have 2 contrasting sections, one slow and march-like, followed by a faster one with imitative textures. In Bach's Suite Number 2, it's scored for flute, strings, and harpsichord in the French grand style, with a haunting opening, elegant jagged rhythms, and a vivacious fugal section showcasing the lovely butterfly lightness of the flute. This is Bach's only surviving work for solo flute and orchestra, and it's quite a showcase for the flute. The first half of our November 12th concert will conclude with a piece that was new to me and will be new to our orchestra family by Dobrinka Tabakova, who is a Bulgarian English composer, born in Bulgaria, and she moved to London at the age of 11. She earned her PhD from King's College of Music, and her music is featured in films, dance, in Sydney, Australia, the American Ballet Theatre in America, many festivals, and she's won a lot of prizes for her scores. For those of you who love New York and walking the High Line Walk, she wrote an orchestral work for the New York Phil for that one. And she's a regular collaborator at the famous Truro Cathedral for choral works that are sacred in nature. And in fact, Gramophone magazine chose her album, Kinnon's Cove on the South Downs, as one of the top recordings of 2019. She also was named the composer of one of the 11 best British orchestral pieces in the last 25 years. Her suite in old style for viola, harpsichord, and strings has the subtitle, The Court Jester Amaro. And Amaro ends up being a panagram of Rameau, a very important Baroque composer. So this is an homage to his writing. This piece was written in 2006, and it's deeply exciting and moving music with glowing harmonies and huge emotional depth. Her suite presents a sonic window into everyday life in the 18th century, an aristocrat's household, hunting, courting in the gardens, dancing, and entertaining. Many undergraduate and graduate music students spend time analyzing and imitating the musical style of Bach and other Baroque and Renaissance masters. Some end up resenting that time, but Tabakova really loves looking back and disciplining and deciphering the future through the language of the past. She said this suite was written as a direct homage to Rameau, whose theatrical ballets and short, condensed movements have long captured my imagination. It was also inspired by a visit I made to Versailles. I had the image of all those magnificent buildings in my head as I was writing. A commentator wrote that the three central movements of this five-movement work are free and more lyrical, with hints of folk elements and the return from hunting sequence, and a deeply intense slow movement. But the composer insists that at its heart, the suite is a modern concerto grosso, a series of dialogues between the soloist, the viola player, and the ensemble. And Tabakova also made note, every composer lives partly in a fantasy world. A violinist friend of Tabakova's stated that the lyricism in this piece comes straight from her heart. Her voice is direct and accessible with melodies that speak to an audience, yet are also elusive and a little bit unfamiliar. The first movement is a fanfare, as if it was being played from the balconies of a huge estate, and people have come back from hunting. The second movement is a little more dissonant and moody through mirrored corridors, which gives you a clue about the sound. The emotional heart is the third movement, a rose garden by moonlight with gorgeous melodies. The fourth movement is the riddle of the barrel organ player, quite jaunty. And the concluding movement recalls the first movement with its high-stepping spirit. After the intermission on November 12th, we are going to be treated to a work that has been rarely played by the Anchorage Symphony, Schubert's Fifth Symphony. And we are so excited about playing this glorious piece to send you back out, having enjoyed live music played with full of heart and pep by your Anchorage Symphony players into the dark winter night. So brace yourselves for the glory here. Schubert was the 12th of 14 children. In 1816, when he wrote this work that you will hear, it was an incredibly busy year. He wrote 200 compositions that year, symphonies 4 and 5, many choral works, 10 chamber works, piano sonatas, and over 100 songs. He was 19 years old, and he was also working as a full-time teacher, teaching kindergarten-age children in his father's school. Wow. His older brother, Ignaz, had a vivid memory of that year, saying, "The likes of us scholastic beasts," Ignaz was also a teacher in the school, "the likes of us scholastic beasts of burden are abandoned to all the roughness of wild youngsters and exposed to a host of abuses, not to mention we were subjected to the further humiliation of an ungrateful public and a lot of dunderheaded bigwigs." Schubert very soon after gave up security for a life in music. He moved to Vienna, where in the mornings he composed, in the afternoons he was found in cafes with his artist friends, and in the evenings he drank a fair amount and had passionate talks about art with anyone who would interact with him. He was always short of cash, and he stated profoundly that the state should keep me. I have come into the world for no purpose but to compose. There were few of his pieces published during his lifetime. Sadly, he died young at age 31, but he wrote 9 symphonies, 19 string quartets, 10 operas, and over 600 songs. During his final illness, he read many novels, including The American, his beloved James Fenimore Cooper, and his favorite book was The Last of the Mohicans. Schubert played the viola, interesting coincidence, since we're featuring violists in our first half suite to homage to Rameau. Schubert played the viola in an amateur orchestra that fit comfortably, they say, in the apartment of a man named Otto Hartwig, who had this apartment in Vienna. He was a very active conductor and music maker. The Fifth Symphony had a reading there, but it was never publicly performed till many years after Schubert's death. He wrote in his diary just a few weeks before completing the Fifth Symphony, "As from afar, the magic notes of Mozart's music still gently haunt me. They show us in the darkness of this life a bright, clear, lovely distance for which we hope." Mozart had died 25 years earlier, but he was still hugely popular. And Schubert obviously models a lot in this symphony on the music of Mozart. For Schubert, the influence of Beethoven, who was alive at this time, that legacy came later on. Schubert's Fifth is a very popular work with musicians and with audiences. It's incredibly graceful, full of wonderful, great melodies and terrific harmonies, and lots of optimism, which we all need at this time. It features, interestingly, in the orchestration, a single flute, and then a couple of oboes and horns, no trumpets, no clarinets, no timpani. So the orchestration is a little unusual. It's in 4 movements. The first, we're out of the gate with 2 joyful Schubertian melodies. The second is just lovely. It sings radiantly, again, the heart of the piece. The third is a rough, vigorous minuet, an homage to Mozart's 40th Symphony, with a contrasting lyrical middle section. And the finale is a cheerful romp. That's all I can say to describe it. It's great fun. It has been described by a historian named Donald Tovey, who's quite renowned in his field, that this is a pearl of great price, and we will cherish hearing it in the dark winter nights of November. The score was lost for many years, but was rediscovered in Schubert's brother's apartment by a team of English historians who also have their own lives and intrigues, etc. Sir George Grove, who wrote an encyclopedia of music history that is still used greatly today, and Sir Arthur Sullivan of the Gilbert and Sullivan team. They discovered the score, and it was first published then, even though it was written in 1816, it was published in 1885. And the first public performance of this symphony was in 1873, 40 years after Schubert's death. He would love to know that we now view this as a masterwork. Please join us November 12th, 7:30 p.m., where your Anchorage Symphony will be playing a stunning program to open your hearts to joy in the darkness of winter. Thank you.